of the Illinois Board of Higher Education for diversifying faculty in the Illinois Program Board. He's given several workshops and presentations at both the local and national conferences, and his specialty is resolving allegations of harassment and discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, religion, and other protected categories through Title VII and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. He also has a special focus in understanding the role that social media can play in dealing with some of these issues. Next we have Dr. Leandra Parris. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. She got her PhD at Georgia State University in school psychology. Her dissertation topic was on how children cope with bullying. She received the Outstanding Dissertation Award from Georgia State's College of Education for that project. She did her internship at the Department of Psychological and Social Services at Dallas Independent School District in Dallas, Texas. She's published 8 peer-reviewed articles on bullying and student victimization, both in psychology journals and in education journals. And she's given several workshops and presentations on bullying at the national and international conferences. And then finally, we have Heather Cosgrove. She's a doctoral intern here at ISU in our student counseling services. Her PhD training is at the University of Buffalo State University of New York. Her dissertation topic is school bullying and harassment. She was a grad assistant at the Center of Bullying Prevention and Intervention. She's recently published a paper in the Journal of College Counseling on how the history of peer victimization influences college students' attachment styles. She's coordinated colloquia on bullying back in SUNY. She's given special presentations both in local and national colleges. Her specialty is bullying and harassment in colleges, especially understanding educational policies back in New York, as well as the general impact of bullying and harassment on victim social development. So without further ado, I have a handful of questions here that the Graduate Association of School Psychologists drafted up for me. I will use those to kind of start things off and use them if we hit a lull. But what I would prefer is that you all have questions, and so give them time to answer, but feel free to raise your hand. We don't have a mic for the audience, but it's a nice intimate setting here, so please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. So without further ado, let's start with the first question. So this film that we just watched, powerful film, the critics of this film say that it paints a very sensational picture, that what we see are very extreme cases. So a question that's always leveled back is, how common is bullying in general in our schools, and what are the typical forms that it may take? So I'll first toss that out to our esteemed guests.
I can take this one. So the research shows that the average rate of bullying is actually about 35%. So that's a little over a third of all of your students between K and 12th grade are actually experiencing it. What we find is that there's physical bullying, so that's hitting, you saw that on the bus. There's verbal, there's name calling, calling each other names and stuff like that. There's relational, and that's actually one of the more prevalent ones, but also the hardest to figure out when it's happening. So that would be spreading rumors, trying to exclude someone, ostracizing someone. And there's also cyberbullying, which is something that's kind of newer in the research and is actually something that I'm trying to get a lot more research done about because we don't know as much about it. But I will say that traditional bullying, face-to-face bullying, what you saw in the movie, happens more often than cyberbullying. But with cyberbullying, what we find is that either kids walk away or they're actually pretty devastated. There's no middle ground, which is scary. So I think that might answer your question that yes, what you're seeing are some extreme situations and cases, but again, 35% on average is still a high rate of your students that are experiencing this.
And I guess I wanted to add that rates of bullying tend to vary depending on level of school. So we tend to see a peak in middle school, and I think a lot of what the documentary showed was kind of middle school experiences. And tends to decrease, not substantially, it still happens obviously, but decrease around 10th grade. And I think the forms of bullying also vary depending on age level as well. So, younger kids tend to be more physical in nature. Once you get to middle school, it becomes more relational and verbal, and I think it kind of carries through to high school.
That was actually the next question I had.
Did you have a question?
I did, unless you wanted to move on.
Please.
Ever since I first saw bullying, one thing that has come up a lot is a lot of criticism towards, especially the principal in the film and administrators in those kinds of settings. And now that we're a lot more aware of bullying in the systems, what are suggested methods that professionals in the field have, preventatively or after the acknowledgement of extreme bullying situations to take instead of what we've seen in this kind of film?
I can take that from an administrator point of view, functioning in a similar capacity, I guess, since at ISU I'd be responsible for some of the alleged behavior. I agree with those that were critical. Now I recognize that the awareness, we are comparing an awareness campaign now based upon information that took place in the past. But I think the way that she approached it with the parents was the most critical, both in her body language and in what she said to them. She came across incredibly passive. They are turning to her for assistance, and they've turned to her for assistance in the past. And she tried to say, well, this is a problem everywhere. Well, right now you have a problem in your office, and you need to give those parents actionable measures that they can have some confidence that you're not only supportive of their message, but that you have steps that you are going to follow, a process. Lay something out rather than giving them that, what I think it was described as a plastic smile and an empty promise. That these are the steps that we're going to follow. And I don't know how large that school district is, but there seemed to be a filtering of accountability. You can come and talk to me, and then I'm going to come and talk to this person, and I'm going to do that. I also think that her response that she's ridden that bus, and that they were as good as gold. I can guarantee you, if I walked into a frat party tonight dressed like that, their behavior is going to be a hell of a lot different than it's going to be if I'm not there. And so I thought that was a poor example to try to convince them that something is going on that bus that they know is very different. So I think that there is a greater awareness in school administrators of this problem. A better way for them to create accountability within their organizational structure, and a better way to communicate with not only the parents of the kids being bullied, but the parents of the children who are doing the bullying. And I think those measurables have made a difference, but were highlighted in her failures in the documentary.
Kind of on the same note, I'm a future teacher, and I am kind of hurt by the way that teachers are displayed in this film. They are displayed as totally not caring and having politicians' smiles, and it broke my heart watching this video, and I can't imagine this happening to one of my students. So is this, are the reactions that we saw from teachers and the feelings that parents have towards teachers, is that real? Do they really think that we don't care? And if they don't, what can we do to convince them that, yeah, we really do care?
So this is actually a great question, and I want to emphasize that I've worked in about 3 to 4 different school districts, and most of them did not handle bullying the way it was shown on this video. It was shown the way on the video to make a good point, to say that here's an example of how this may not be the best way to do this. Teachers we've done some research talking to teachers, and really what we find is that they're overwhelmed. It's hard to know what's happening in the classroom, and when someone comes and tells you about it, there's some miscommunication about, well, what is my role as a teacher? Do I tell an administrator? Do I intervene? Am I supposed to call the parents? So my response to that would be, in the systems that I've seen most effectively respond to bullying, the teachers had a very clear-cut role from administrators telling them, if someone reports bullying, here's what you do. We hear from students that the teachers that they feel most comfortable are the ones who validate how they feel, and they listen to what they have to say, and they don't tell the bully. They don't want to be tattled on. They don't want the bully to find out they said anything. And that's a hard line to walk, because then how do you intervene? So I think teachers are in a hard spot. There is a lot of pressure put on teachers for that. But again, I think it goes back to what Shane was saying, that if you have clear policies and you have an outline and teachers know who they're supposed to go to when this is happening, then you'll see a reduction.
As far as the situation went in the video where the same principal made the bully and the victim kind of shake hands right there, clearly that was the worst thing to do. And handled, like intervened there, but in a much better, more effective way? Is there any?
I would say, it's never really recommended to have them both together right after an incident. Like that never really kind of comes to fruition in a productive way. So if I were in that position, I would kind of pull the victim aside first. Clearly he was upset. He didn't look, he looked very distressed, and kind of, hear him out and hear his side of the story before, engaging with the bully as well. But I would, just kind of a general sense of keeping it separate and really validating the victim, and then going to the bully with the appropriate kind of intervention that's recommended through the school policies or what's kind of been passed down to teachers. But yeah, that general handshaking, like let's just make up and agree that this will never happen again, that doesn't really work.
And the other thing with that, I think we talked in Sci-Fi the other night, is that, bullies can actually be pretty socially competent. I think that there is a myth that bullies are the big, loving jock kind of guy, and really they know when to turn it off. They know when to save face in front of the teacher. Like, the kid knew to put his hand out there and stare the kid down, like if you don't shake it. And so I think it's good for teachers and parents and everyone to be kind of aware that kids know how to turn on a smile, and they know how to get out of those situations. So make sure you're doing the investigation to figure out all the details, like she was saying.
What actions are currently taking place in higher education to teach our future educators, I guess, how to handle bullying in an effective way in the modern world?
I can share that at ISU, one of the major campaigns that has a connection to bullying is the concern over sexual assault. And to trying to lead by example. Obviously, it's the university's responsibility to prepare you all to go into the world, get a job, but also do good and represent the values that ISU has instilled into you. And so, be it teacher education or other professions, trying to promote a sense of accountability, a sense of respect, a sense of tolerance. We'll often use the buzzword diversity, but really it's a sense of tolerance. You are going to encounter people different than you. You are going to encounter ideas that you disagree with. And tolerance isn't agreeing with it. It's agreeing to disagree. And so while I don't know of any specific campaign targeted towards bullying, I think it's a more holistic approach. If we can put you out into the world confident, educated, you are going to identify a situation and know how to intervene and read it appropriately. Know who the aggressor is, know who the victim is, and know what steps to follow. And so I know that the programs, the educational programs that the university offers, a lot of care is put into that to not only have you behave a certain way while you're on this campus, but have that carry with you after graduation.
One thing I'm always struck by when I watch this film is how a lot of the people either had no idea what was going on or they didn't realize it was that bad. That phrase came up a lot, right? So, the phrase boys will be boys, kids will be kids, etc. While we have Shane here, one thing I wanted to ask about is there could be a way of reframing or interpreting this behavior in the sense of harassment, right? I mean, kids will be kids versus harassment. One phrase is a little more gravitas. So can you tell us a little bit about how the university's policy would speak to these behaviors?
And that's one thing that bothered me is we were getting lots of common terms of our, kids will be kids, I can't see everything all the time. There just seemed to be a lot of excuses. And so I don't know how other universities have it structured, but I like the way ISU has it structured because I structured it this way. I'm the one responsible. If there is an issue, you come to me, you deal with me, and I am held accountable by the president. I was held accountable by President Bowman, Flanagan, and then President Dietz. But at least the message has been the same. Find it, fix it. No excuses. And the nice thing about the ISU community is we have a set of standards that if I deem that you fail those standards, you're gone. And I don't say that to beat my chest or you know, try to be some 90s college movie villainous dean. It's just that that's how we control it. We try to get the persons who are victims the support that they need, be it on campus or off campus, and then address the behavior through disciplinary consequence. I recognize that we are an institution of higher education, and there are some who feel that the social justice model of educating people who do these things and giving them the opportunity to correct their behavior is part of our responsibility. I don't follow that model. Now, that's not going to mean I'm going to be disproportionately punish somebody for a minor infraction, but on issues of sexual assault, racial harassment or discrimination, LGBTQ issues, if you haven't figured it out in some reasonable degree by now, I don't have confidence that you're going to figure it out in the next 3 years or less, and you can pursue your education someplace else. I have a responsibility to protect the university community, and I take that very seriously, and if I don't, my boss does. And so that is a great incentive for me to the buck literally stops at me, and I prefer it that way. And so that, in my mind, is the clearest and most efficient way to create that accountability that's necessary that we didn't see in some of these scenarios.
Lots of hands.
Well, you had mentioned that if you find them wrong, you would kick them out, but that's like in a college setting. How would you approach that in like a high school setting where it's not so easy to just say, go find your education somewhere else?
Right, and this is where my experience at the State Board of Education can come into play. I didn't have this role at an individual school district, but the same general rules apply. Now, I can understand that it can be complicated in that we saw a lot of it appears smaller school districts, maybe rural school districts, where you don't have the option of just hopping from normal west to normal community or something like that. But there's nothing that guarantees you a spot in a certain school if you can't meet those behavioral expectations. And it's kind of the Band-Aid type of thing. You can either peel it off slowly, and I think that's what we saw here, is trying to make everybody happy and try to resolve it so that all parties walk away, feeling that there's some value. Some of these situations, there just isn't going to be that type of resolution. And if it involves removing a student from the school, then they have an opportunity to attend an alternative school, or that they may have a financial burden of trying to attend a school out of district and deal with the transportation costs and things. So just because you live in a geographic school district does not guarantee you your spot to complete your education in that district.
And I would just want to add to that there are programs for working with bullies. And it's another reason why we need to identify them early on. I've worked one-on-one individually with bullies, and once they get into that system where they already have that reputation, it's hard to help them. I think we spend a lot of time talking about working with victims, and we don't know, or what we don't always step back and think of is that these bullies sometimes have their own story, and they have their own pain, and they have their own background, and this is how they're showing it. And so early prevention and intervention would be that we should probably be working with them as well, not just writing them off. But of course, once it does get to that point, he's right, you would have to find another alternative for getting them somewhere else. But I wanted to plug that, just to put that out there.
Quick, how did you know, so we're talking about working one-on-one with both victims and perpetrators here. Is there much in the counseling or clinical literature about working with the perpetrator?
You know, and I think this is reflected in research as well, that there's not much, I mean, there is some, but not a lot of working with perpetrators of bullying and victimization. I would say at the counseling center here at ISU, we kind of see a little bit of both. We see I've definitely worked with a lot of students who have come in with histories of bullying victimization and kind of sorting through that. And people who have felt guilty about their bullying histories as well and sorting through that too. So as far as resources and approaching it, and in my experience in working in like schools, like high schools and middle schools, I've seen empathy training kind of gaining momentum and starting very young with children in elementary school and kind of teaching caring about people and teaching people not to be a bystander, to be what's called like an upstander and intervening and kind of this is not the culture that we want in our school. So I've kind of seen it at all these different levels.
There were several other hands out there, so whoever feels free. I see you. Yes, you in the back.
In the documentary, there were some students who were able to advocate for themselves and others who weren't. What, as a future special educator, I'm interested in wondering what screening measures there are for identifying victims of bullying who are nonverbal or just unable of advocating for themselves.
That's a great question, and something that I recommend to school districts, and I'm mindful of resources obviously, but what's called a needs assessment, and that can just be a brief survey that the school sends out to students or a teacher hands out to their classroom to kind of ask general questions about bullying and victimization. Kind of get at, not necessarily identifying perpetrators and victims, but there are assessments that do that. But kind of just like, is verbal victimization a big deal at this school, or is it more physical, or are we really struggling with cyberbullying here? And so a needs assessment really can be, it doesn't have to be a measure or an assessment tool that you buy. You can kind of create it based on what you're really looking for in this school. And I've seen it be very successful in several school districts.
And I would add to that a lot of research teams tend to have those scales. So the team that I lead, we have one of those, and we are more than happy to allow schools to come and talk to us about how to use those and implement them in their school systems. And I think that research would show that needs assessments that provide the most information are culture specific. So they are kind of in-house, and they're ones that really deal with what the school identifies to be their needs. So I think that people should feel free to kind of think a little outside the box and not necessarily find what she was saying, the ones you would buy or that are prepackaged.
And some information for your lab and some of these other resources are in the back, correct?
Yes, they are.
Okay, so little plug. There's free handouts on your way out. I think, yes.
Kind of going off of what she was saying, are there things to look for students who don't, whether they're the perpetrator or the one who's being bullied, are there key things to look for if they're not vocalizing what's going on or the parents aren't vocalizing?
So the first thing that I usually looked for was social withdrawal, and so you'll tend to see them shy away from people who used to be their friends, or maybe they just tend to sit by themselves in the lunchroom or kind of wander about during recess. You do see them demonstrating a little bit more depression and anxiety, but what we would look for there is like a change. So a kid who used to be happy or used to really take a lot of pleasure from things and suddenly no longer does. Other warning signs would be unexplained bruises or bruises that they're really not wanting to explain. Cyberbullying, a pretty big indicator is that they suddenly want nothing to do with technology. So our kids are pretty wired. So if I have a client who doesn't want anything to do with technology, that's a huge red flag for me because they all want to have something to do with technology. You might see them startle every time they get a text message. Every time the G-chat thing bleeps, they kind of jump or they get upset. So I think symptoms of bullying and things like that might look like depression and anxiety, but there are definitely some key factors, like I said, the social withdrawal being one of the bigger ones.
I just wanted to add, attendance rates tend to be a good indicator of students who are being victimized. So if a student really doesn't want to go to school or doesn't want to get on the bus at all, or is missing a lot of class, that may be a sign that they're being bullied.
One thing I'm familiar with, a lot of professions, aside from just teachers, require people to be mandated reporters. And in case of abuse or extreme circumstances, there's policies and codes and guidelines of what to follow. What is generally kind of the policy for teachers to follow, specifically for children in, elementary or high school or middle school, when there are cases of bullying? What are kind of immediate things that they can do to intervene in those situations?
I can take this one. I do the mandated crime reporter for ISU, and so it's the same responsibility for K-12 educators. If you are an educator, teachers, have interaction with students, principal, basically anybody that is going to serve in a position of authority or autonomy in a K-12 environment, you are legally obligated to report what you deem to be, bruising, any of these types of behaviors, because that's often the tip of the iceberg. There are others, sexual abuse, physical abuse, etc. Identifying it is the key. So you don't have to have all the facts, and you're actually discouraged from trying to investigate it on your own, because you don't know if there's an abusive situation at home or abusive situation with another student. But that expectation is rather high and unforgiving, and I think we understand why.
What if it's more verbal than physical though? Because you can't see that necessarily, and so you couldn't call someone and say, oh, this happened, how do you handle that then?
I think when we're dealing with school systems, every school system has their own policy. And so when you get hired by a system, the first thing you should do is check the policy as far as, is the assistant principal the person who's the key lead on that? Is it the counselor? Is it the school psychologist? And so when I was saying before, the systems that seem to do really well with addressing bullying were the ones that had really clear-cut policies. So the teachers know when it happens what to do. If you go to a school system and that does not happen, then you should probably ask somebody, well, if bullying happens, what would you like me to go to your principal and say, what should my first step be? Do you want to know? Do you want me to try to talk to them? So I think, again, to reiterate, teachers do the best they can. And I think that it's clarifying that for yourself so that when it happens, you're not struggling trying to juggle all these things in the classroom while also saying, this is going on, who do I go to? And also, validating, like Heather was saying, validating with the student, listening to what they have to say, being empathetic, and then also really hearing their needs. Maybe they don't want you to intervene just now, they just want you to listen. And so I think it's a fine line that we try to walk as school personnel. Common policies usually are that you would tell an administrator, and there's that one person who is in charge of sort of delineating the consequences that the school has predetermined.
Kind of dovetail off that slightly. So you mentioned verbal, right? And if I remember my ethics training correctly, harassment is part of the things that we are mandatory reporters for, like sexual harassment, for example. That I know that obviously includes quid pro quo and things, but verbal, does that fall under?
It does.
Okay.
It does, and that's obviously the most common. And so basically, the threshold here is that if you identify behavior that you kind of know it when you see it. If it makes you question, should I say something? Say it. I mean that everyone has their own internal measuring stick, but if you see something that or become suspicious of something, say it. I'm only able to fix the problems that are brought to my attention, and I would rather have somebody bring something that turns out to be nothing than to say, well, I'm going to sit tight for a little bit and see how this rolls. Because from an administrator point of view, if it does turn into something and there's reason to believe that you saw something and didn't say something, then you become a very easy target for the school administration to turn. And it's an ugly type of environment where that happens, but that's a reality, and especially as a new school teacher. So there's never any penalty or frowning on somebody bringing whatever they perceive to my attention, or at least in a K-12 setting, to an administrator's attention, because one, you have that responsibility and you need to discharge it, but two, it could be the key piece that hasn't happened yet that opens up the door for the assistive services to take place.
I have a technical question about the documentary itself.
Do you know how they were able to achieve those scenes on the bus where someone was obviously filming, but it didn't seem to in any way intimidate the perpetrators of the bullying on that one kid?
I don't know how they did that. It's been a long time since my film school days. But I mean, at different points in time, there were some of the people in the video who had their faces blurred out.
Right.
So presumably they would have had to have signed some sort of release form. So they all probably knew that they might be filmed at some point in time. And it's possible that they had the camera just going for weeks maybe, and they just became accustomed to it.
Was it the camera on a person, presumably, sitting there filming? Because
I'm guessing it was
Yeah.
mounted, because
Yeah.
that's one thing that surprised me, is because a lot of these people know that they're on camera,
and they're still doing it.
and they're still not putting their best self out there.
And I get the feeling they were in the community for a really long time, so there's certain things that you see happen in the documentary that was going on, just happened to come up while they were filming, so I think they got very acclimated to the cameras being around. And some of the shots in the bus you can see definitely were mounted at the top, so they were just there. Kids don't always change their behavior when the camera's on. Like I said, our kids are wired, and they're very used to cameras and phones and everything being around, so I'm guessing it didn't take that long for them to start forgetting the camera was there.
So I'm back, yeah.
In the film, we were told the story of a teacher that did roll call during the class period and called out all the boys and all the girls, and then called out the young lady that was featured in the film. Has there been any research done that shows a percentage of teachers that actually commit bullying themselves?
I'm not familiar with the research specifically, but I do know that it happens. You know, with bullying, there's inherently a power differential, so there's certainly possibilities that teachers would abuse this power. And I've seen more and more school systems incorporating kind of policies for teachers as well. You know, we see a lot of policies for victims and bullies and what do we do about that, but also staff being held to certain standards where harassment and abuse is not tolerated too. But unfortunately it does happen, we've seen, and you know, I've just kind of seen kind of a build up to being more aware of that too, because teachers, there are some bad apples everywhere. So.
Yeah, I was working in a school district once, and we did a lot of work with victims, and we would have them do these school safety maps where they would map out where they felt safe. And every single kid, all 102 of them, pointed out the gym as being unsafe. So we were like, oh, they must be getting picked on in the gym, and it was actually the gym teacher, not the kids themselves. And so we just took that information to the administration, and the teacher was talked to, and he was very much like, I was just joking, that's how I am with the kids. And so he actually had to take a step back and realize that what was him just being what he thought was playful and maybe aggressive, and it ended up actually working out really well. So sometimes with teachers, we just need to say that not all kids respond to that kind of teasing that you think other kids really connect with. So we always give the benefit of the doubt.
So you can really see bullying in many different forms, even as early as like pre-K. What are some ways, because I don't know, I guess the victims, they're still really young, so they don't really get the whole bullying thing. I feel like they're not as phased, but what are some good ways you can intervene with the bully? Because obviously, if they're starting bullying now already, if they're being reinforced for that, then that's going to lead to more bullying. So what's a good way to intervene with the bully right then, at that young of an age?
We do a lot of empathy training, so a lot of putting yourself in other people's shoes. Also, what we find is both victims and bullies don't always pick up on facial expressions or social cues that indicate emotions. So we spend a lot of times playing like charades, like what emotion is this? So I think it's a lot of giving them skills that maybe they haven't quite gained yet as far as perspective taking, and just understanding that if someone does this to you, it hurts, so why would you think that you're doing it if someone else wouldn't? And that so far has been probably one of the best, at least that I've experienced, maybe some problem solving steps as well, just working through a problem without taking it out on someone else. But that would be my biggest suggestion. I don't know if you've had any other.
No, actually empathy training was kind of my central focus too with bullies. You know, starting them as young as possible is recommended. You know, as young children, when you're like 3 or 4, you might not really even realize what you're doing. But kind of teaching those skills early and really, again, kind of emphasizing a culture of we are going to care about each other, this is not tolerated, and, you know, throughout classrooms.
you don't want a 4-year-old being labeled as a bully. So I think we're also very careful about the labels that we throw around. If I have a victim who doesn't recognize him or herself as a victim, I don't say that. That's their call, and the same thing for the bullies. I don't try to put that label on them.
Jumping back to the mandated reporting perspective, should a teacher follow through with their obligation and report to the administration, however uncommon you said it was, the way that the administrator responds in the video, should that be the instance in a situation, what is the next step for the teacher to take?
Okay, so for example, if the teacher feels that they're sharing it with the supervisor was not taken seriously, then the teacher should go to the next level. I mean, so I obviously it's going to depend on the size of the school district, but I'm aware of situations when I was at ISB where a teacher felt that, you know, politics were at play, or they weren't being heard, or they were, you know, encouraged to you know, look at it through another filter, and they were uncomfortable with that. And so if you're getting absolutely no assistance in your individual district, you can bounce outside of the district entirely and approach the regional superintendent of schools, who is an elected official over a geographic area for public schools, who can then address the issue from the outside looking in.
What is some common statistics that you've seen in research recently about like demographics and bullying? Is it seen more in urban areas or in rural areas? Is there anything that's updated either since the documentary was made?
So there was actually a really large study that came out that sort of indicated that there's really not much of a difference between rural, suburban, and urban. I think the ways that it are handled might be a little different. Most of the differences we see are based on age or gender. So boys and younger students are more likely to engage in physical or experience physical, whereas girls tend to have a lot of relational bullying going on, and that tends to increase up through high school. Cyberbullying tends to be the sort of even playing ground. Girls and boys are both equally likely to experience that and engage in that, and that tends to peak around high school. We have seen that in cyberbullying in particular, when we look at urban versus suburban districts tend to have a lot of resources for technology and access, whereas your urban and your rural students are like, this is happening to me, but I have other things in my life that I'm more worried about, and I just don't deal. It's just a little bit of a different saliency, if you would like and call it that way, yeah. But for the most part, it happens everywhere at a pretty equal rate.
Technically, this time we're over our 9 o'clock ending time. We do have the room, the theater, for just a little bit longer, but I think at this point in time I'd like to, for people who need to leave, they can. I want to give one last round of applause for Shane. So we'll be here for a little while. The panelists will be here if you have questions. Thank you all very much for coming out. Hopefully we'll make this a regular occurrence. Thank you again to Dean Simpson and the college, the Department of Psychology, and best wishes for the evening.